thank you all for coming today to remember my brother David. For me, it's good to be thinking about David here in Duluth. Though David left here almost 60 years ago and lived almost all of his adult life in the Boston area. But his upbringing was here, and we carry the roots of our upbringing with us wherever we go. But Duluth was, for him, I think, important not just as a point of beginning, or as a place from which influences attached that had some or other effect in his life going forward. Duluth was important, I think, for what he did here. And what he did here was really to engage with becoming. And by becoming, I don't mean giving way to a kind of driving ambition. I don't think David had particular goals that he followed with some kind of relentless passion. But he did constantly and with unusual forethought and consideration think about finding things, discovering what he liked, what was good for him, latching on to things that worked, casting off things that didn't work. The best and most important example of David's becoming is of course Susan. He met Susan in Duluth, of course, at UMD. And the astonishing and yet very well-founded confidence that he had that this was a real match, and that their partnership, a partnership of true souls, would endure, as it did. And his becoming the person who would meet Susan was his transformation from a person at the end of his upbringing here in Duluth to the man he became for the rest of his life. But there are some other, probably more trivial, but still worth mentioning, becomings from his Duluth years. One of them, David was an enthusiastic athlete, as I think some of you know, and from a young age participated in all sorts of team sports, and did so through high school. But at the end of his last football season with Duluth Central, it was the last game of the year, the annual slugfest between Central and Benfeld, usually a cold, wet slog at the end of a Duluth fall, if fall even exists in Duluth. I don't know what the outcome of the game was, but at the end of the game, and he told me this years later, he was changing his uniform, he was changing out of uniform in the field house, He turned to his friend who was nearby and said, "Well, we'll never have to do that again." Well, David was captain of this team, and his friend looked at him with some surprise, kind of thinking, maybe something a little more sentimental or profound at this turning point in our lives. But no, David had moved on from high school football. Now, he remained an athlete for decades and was an accomplished tennis player, played a lot of pickup basketball, but he did it now for joy. It was different from the kind of ball he played as a kid growing up here. Well, at the same time, when he was a senior in high school, he had a role in a play at Central. It's the first time he had acted on stage. And he was surprised, I think, to find how meaningful the experience was for him. He had no prior exposure to that art as a performer. But he went on to study drama at UMD. And after he finished his graduate education and had his first academic job, he founded a highly improbable drama club at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy, which is peopled entirely with students who, for the most part, have had no exposure to this sort of thing. And so he gave them the chance to have the same kind of creative joy that he felt here in Duluth as a high school senior. He gave them the chance to see something that they might not have otherwise seen. At the same time, again, back to his days in high school and in college here, he was becoming an accomplished writer. First as a journalist, writing, editing the UMD paper, and then writing for the News Tribune. He had a real gift for journalism. But he also was developing as a student scholar the craft of writing academic pieces, which he continued to do for the rest of his career. But, and Susan has already alluded to this, at the same time he was becoming a poet. And I think he began writing poetry maybe when he was in high school or not long after, but I can't say that for sure because it was a very private exercise for him. I don't think I saw more than half a dozen of his poems, maybe not even that many, before he left for Boston. But he gradually became less private about his work. And over the years, published widely, a few at a time, here and there, until in Singapore, some of his poems, not nearly all of them, but some of his poems were collected in this book and published there. Now, some of you, I think, really don't know David as a poet. And so I'd like to make an introduction today. I think it's appropriate today because because so many of his poems focus on questions of mortality and loss. And that's why we're here today. He said in one of his poems that we, the living, feel the loss of those who have died more than they do, or more than we do on our last day. And I think he really understood the need to think about and come to terms with loss. I'll tell you that reading his poems has been enormously helpful to me in the months since he died. He really, I think, has thought about mortality in such a way that he has a way of helping us grieve. And so I'm going to read you a poem he wrote. And this is a poem that he wrote on the death of our dear beloved stepmother, Jean.
Stephen, could you hold it closer? Thank you.
The poem is very specific to Jean and her life and her personality. Very specific because that's what a good poem is. But it also, I think, says something that is more than the specifics of the details that are recited in the poem. It says something more about the human condition, because that's what a good poem does. The poem is called In Memory of My Stepmother, September 2007. Of course, all deaths may be considered cruel, because no infant at birth has any knowledge or suspicion of it. Instead, it gorges on living and doesn't know until later, and then only gradually, and with disbelief that it's there waiting for everyone. A trick that's sometimes played suddenly and sometimes not, but surely played. Blotting out faces, flowers, the sun, everything gone to nothing, leaving only unimaginable darkness. Jean, our dear Jean, your death in Duluth was one of the sudden ones, coming on a Saturday when no one was there with you, and while I was on the other side of the world in Singapore, having an early lunch with Susan near Marina Bay. You were 92 years old. But the last time we talked on the phone, you said you were feeling fine and had just come in from the garden. Though at the end of September in Duluth, with the frosts already coming on, there wasn't in truth much gardening left to do. Or if there was, your daughter Ginny likely would have done it. Later, the doctor reported it probably happened quickly, without suffering. He may or may not have been right. But, dear Jean, I must ask you, what will now become of our forlorn world emptied of you? Who will report to us on the latest books, or tell us a funny story about a neighbor on Park Point, or try a new recipe on us when we're back in town? Who now will give us those raspberries from that beloved garden, so fresh and so sweet, or those beans and that lettuce which somehow seemed to appear on the table whenever we came to visit, playing hooky from our regular lives, where we never had raspberries, hardly ever fruit or vegetables from a private garden, tended with such faithfulness and love. Tended, Jean, by you. There are no answers, only memories of other answers, and of you.